Welcome to Being Patient Live Talks. I'm Mark New, host at Being Patient. Today we have a special guest who has a wealth of knowledge on living with dementia. He was diagnosed more than 10 years ago, but today stays active in a number of advocacy groups and staying creatively challenged. I'd like to welcome Wally Cox to our show. Wally, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Wally, first tell us about your condition and when you first began noticing signs where things didn't seem quite right.
Well, I was an insurance agent with a AAA for decades, and at work, I started suddenly struggling with things that previously had just been, routine, like recognizing icons on my screen. I'd come in, and then, they'd redo the computer and the icons would move around, and I couldn't remember which icon went with what thing, and I have to get my assistant to come in and help me. They had provided for me. And then I was at a school board meeting. I was on the school board, and they started having a big discussion about a project we were working on. And this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm sitting there thinking, I have no idea what they're talking about. None. And I made it all the way to the end of the meeting, which was about 2 hours long, not remembering what it is we're talking about and why we're talking about it, even though it's something we'd been working on. We supposedly read, but I couldn't remember it. And I went home to my wife and I said, "You know what?" I said, "There's just something wrong. I don't know what's going on." But I had people come in and say to me, "Hey, we were here yesterday, Wally, and you're supposed to have this quote worked up for us." And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, it's not that I forgot your name. I don't even recognize you. I don't know who this is. I'm thinking, and I'm thinking, well, is somebody gaslighting me? Obviously not. Something's wrong. So we went to the family physician, and actually for my wife's appointment, and I said, "Hey, by the way, I'm having this problem, this problem." And all of a sudden he goes, "I think we're going to talk to a Wally today." So he gave me a couple of little tests and said, "You need to go down to, I'm going to make you an appointment at Stanford. And we're going to send you down to Stanford and have you, that's when you take a look at you. Maybe, you might have had a little stroke or something. You never know, but we'll go take a peek." And so we went down to Stanford, and I got diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which uh, I laugh and refer to as Alzheimer's light. It's a diagnosis that there's something wrong. They don't know yet really what it is, and they don't know if it's going to go forwards or backwards or just remain where it's at. That's kind of what they do, and I think that's pretty much the normal operation, because they don't want to give you the really big hammer news right away. They want to have a little time to look at you and compare you from today, and then have you in 6 months or a year come in. Well, a year later, I went in and they said, after a bunch of exams, they said, "Well, it's apparent to us you have Alzheimer's."
And you're how old at this time?
So around 62, 63. And, the doctor, he was, he's a good guy, but he said basically, you probably have maybe 4 years left to live, two at home if you're lucky, and you'll be institutionalized, and then you'll be dead within 4 years. This is pretty much guaranteed what's going to happen if this diagnosis is correct.
And
So
that was how many years ago?
that was 10 years ago.
10 years ago. And here you are doing
Yeah.
an interview and
Well,
talking very clearly about everything. Yeah.
what we say in group nowadays is, you've seen one case of dementia, you've seen one case of dementia. There's no certainty to these diagnoses as of right now. Certainly, there's some indications after a little bit of watching you as to where you're probably going to go. But anyways, I got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then a year or two later, because of the distance, we went to a doctor down more in Santa Rosa area, and I live up in NorCal. And he said, "No, I think you got frontotemporal. I'm positive." And I'm like, "Well, okay, well, what do we do about that?" "Well, we can't do any more about that than we really do about Alzheimer's." So I'm thinking, well, who cares? Then what's the difference? And then I got invited to be part of a study at UCSF, and they took me down there, and they spent about 3 or 4 days working me over and said, "You definitely don't have Alzheimer's, and you definitely don't have frontal temporal, but you have a slow moving version of like an Alzheimer's." And in parts of the left front of my brain showed issues and some of the way my thinking goes. And this probably fits in pretty well with my background, because my grandmother died. She was senile, and she spent quite a few years senile and then passed away. My dad died just a few years ago with dementia. He was institutionalized for probably the last 6 years of his life. His sister died with dementia. My brother, who's actually 20 years younger than me, he has they pretty sure Lewy body and Parkinson's. So there seems to be a run through our family of people with these kind of issues. But my dad first started having problems in his 60s, like I did. We just thought he was being obstinate. He couldn't figure out how to use the computer and he'd forget stuff. And we're thinking, oh, come on, quit kidding. And then, he lived about 25 or so years with this problem, but slowly declining. And fortunately, I think in my case, most of my issues, most of my issues are in executive functioning. So things that I did a lot with work, with reading policies and contracts and writing up deals and adding and subtracting and dividing and what all the other jazz is. I'm incapable of it now. I find it very, very difficult even sometimes to figure out how much of a tip is I'm supposed to leave, that kind of thing. So I always have to have my wife check. I put the money down and I don't add it up correctly in my mind. I'm confident that I did it right, but I didn't. So from my eyes looking out, I think, hey, I'm still firing on all eight cylinders. But then, when a form showed up last year and I went ahead and filled it out despite my wife's objections, because I said, I'll fill this out. I know what I'm doing. And I went in the office and got the pen and paper out and filled out all 5 pages and sent it in. And, 2 weeks later, it shows back up. And, I didn't answer page 2. Half of page 3 was empty. Forgot to sign my name. And I was 100% convinced I did it right. And that's pretty typical of a lot of people with dementia is they're sometimes the last person to see it. But I was fortunate enough to recognize that something was really wrong. And I think a lot of it had to do with watching my dad's decline and how he was. And we were aware of that. And we were care providers for him at the end of his life. And so we kind of saw that path. And my wife's like, well, look out. I think we need to take a look at this. So that's my story.
And you talk a lot about how, uh, in some ways, the diagnosis process and also, getting diagnosed, sometimes you feel doctors sort of leave you hanging out to dry. And that how did you find your way into being able to cope with that and getting the necessary help that you needed?
Yeah, I think I've heard heard it described as the tragedy diagnosis. It's all over but the singing. And I think a lot of that there's a lot going on in there. I think doctors as a whole, the physicians, they want to cure you. They want to fix things. And it's a disease that you really can't fix. So it's very difficult for your physician or your care person there in the medical field to give you news where they can't take care of you. I mean, I've got to can't help but think they feel like a failure. And, a lot of times you have close connections to these people and they've learned to like you or love you. And, then they got to give you this news that's very devastating. So I went home and after the diagnosis, I was lucky enough, my wife said to me when we got in the car, I'll never leave you. It meant a lot to me right then because I was pretty, pretty hammered, you might say. And I thought, well, that's something, that's maybe everything. And we went home and I dug a hole and pulled a rock over my head. I resigned from the school board. I was elected to that, luckily, a couple of times. And the the newspaper called and wanted to know, well, why did you quit? What's the inside scoop? Who did what to who and what's going on? And I said, I'm sick. The guy's like, what? I said, I'm sick. I'm very ill and I'm devastated and I don't want to talk about it. Okay, can you just leave me alone? And he said, well, of course. Sorry. And hung up. And I hid from people and I was ashamed. I was terribly, terribly ashamed. And it's one of the things that comes with this diagnosis is shame. And it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I proceeded to build this wall between my wife and myself because I wanted to cut myself off emotionally. I just don't want to have to deal with it. And in her wisdom, she said, we need to go down and there's a Alzheimer's group down in Santa Rosa we can get involved in. So we go down to this Alzheimer's group, and they sort of separate you. They have the care providers and caregivers in one group, and then they have the people that are diagnosed in the other group. And they only take people who are in the early onset stages because you got to be able to communicate. It's one of the things you lose after a while. And we went into this room, and they started telling us about the disease and asking us how we're feeling. I remember it was like the second week I was in there. I said, how many of you guys, there's like 12 people, plus the person teaching the class. And they said, well, does anybody got any questions? I said, yeah, how many of you guys thought about killing yourself so far? And every hand in the room but one went. And I thought, wow, it's not just me. Because I'm thinking maybe I should just, for the sake of my wife and my family, I should just end my life and get out of the way. That's how you feel. And that's how it's projected to you. There's no point in going on. And in that group, there were a couple of people that were pretty outspoken about their diagnosis, and in getting together with these people, then eventually through Dementia Alliance International, which is a group of people that get together and have Zoom meetings and stuff, and also DAA and Reimagining Dementia, I found my niche. I found my family. And that is, I connected with people who are experiencing the same thing I am. And it doesn't always end well. It never does end well, really. But I mean, you get to see people live their lives and realize that there's a lot you can still do despite your diagnosis. There's a lot you can't do, but there's a ton that you can do. And some of the things that you can do are things that you wouldn't have done had you still been going to work or climbing that next hill that you think you have to climb. And it ended up being, in many ways, a blessing. I quit a job that was really starting to overwhelm me anyways, in many ways, and the stress was sky high. And I live a fairly stress-free existence now. And I spend a lot of time in our groups talking particularly to people who've been recently diagnosed that isn't the end of your life. It's just another chapter. And I know that's kind of a cliche, but it's true. And there's still a lot to do. You can still, I can still garden, and I can still ride a bike, and I can still go for a walk, and I actually can still drive a car, although I try to do it as little as possible, and love on my children. And it gave me an opportunity. This diagnosis, instead of, dying at 11 o'clock at night in my bed, this diagnosis has given me time to reignite my faith, to re-strengthen my relationships with my family and my children and my friendships, to reinvigorate our marriage in many ways that we wouldn't have done with travel and stuff. So despite the horror, in many ways, it's been a blessing. And I think that's, the old story about making lemonade out of lemons is, you have to, I have two choices. I can give up, or I can get out. And I decided to get out.
You sent us a quote that now totally makes sense to me. And tell me about that C.S. Lewis quote.
Would you read it for me? I mean, I kind of know it, but I never get it quite right.
Sure, you sent us a quote from C.S. Lewis. I can say it exactly, but it seems to really make sense to how what sort of fueled your healing. And you sent this quote that says, "Friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, 'What, you too? I thought I was the only one.'"
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the, that is the most significant thing. If I could, anybody I'm talking to today who's been recently diagnosed or is diagnosed and they're suffering from the depression and malaise and everything that goes with it, is get connected with other people that are on the same journey, and it's invigorating. I go to groups during the week and I come out. I mean, sometimes it's terribly sad, and sometimes it's terribly hilarious. And everybody there knows what you're going through when you talk about how you got up in the morning and you forgot to take your pills, and then you forgot this and you forgot that, and your wife's looking at you like, really? And you're thinking, well, I thought I did it, or any of the other silly stuff that happens as you go through this part of your journey. And I just think it's really, really important to get connected. Because, your two choices to go through this alone or go through this connected. And I'd much rather go through it connected. And I've always liked people and enjoyed conversations. And I still have my voice, which not everybody's fortunate enough to do. But even if you don't have your voice, you can go to the group so you can listen. And you can type in.
Another thing that's been very therapeutic for you, it sounds very simple, but doodling has changed your life, right?
Well, yeah, I doodle a lot when I'm in group. So a lot of times people will say, well, you look like you're not paying attention. I'm usually drawing. I like to draw or paint or whatever. And, and so I've been working on, I just doodle a lot and draw things that catch my attention. And, I like to draw sometimes about things that I'm thinking about. And so some of my doodles are specific to emotional things and stuff that I'm going through. And sometimes my doodles are just playful. And sometimes I don't know, there's just something else.
I
So I'm
think you're
not an
being very
artist,
hum
but
I
I'm
think
a
you're
doodler.
being very I think you're being very humble when we call it doodling or you call it doodling because I expected to see really crude sort of drawings, but if you could show us some of your so-called doodling that has really you know
Sure.
invigorated your passion for art.
Yeah. So here I'll hang on a second here. Let me grab some of this. So a while back, I had an afternoon to kill, and I was didn't know what to do, so I took a piece of paper and I drew an S down it like that, and thought, okay, what can I make that into? So I made it into a scene of a village. So now you got to remember this is on like a regular piece. This is on a piece of computer paper, so it's yeah. Bear with me, but I'll see if I can show this to you. So here we go.
Okay, hold it up high. Hold it up high. Yeah.
So you
That's an S. That is a lot more than an S.
So there's an S there, and you can see the kids on the skateboard and the people barbecuing and the Acme meat truck broken down, and up above there's a biplane with a thing saying okie dokie used cars. It's been a while. Hot air balloons and stuff. So it's just kind of my imagination, taking over saying, what can you do with an S? Here's just the other day while I was watching in a meeting, I drew this just for fun, just some animals. Here's let's see what else have I got here. Oh, this is one I did in pencil, and then I went back and did it in ink. This is just a bunch of heads.
Wow.
Yeah,
Can you show us the one that you talk a lot about walls in your life and explain sort of the symbolism in your drawing about walls?
absolutely. I was my wife's care provider for a while years ago. We've been together since we were kids, and she was we were told she's dying from lupus, and I was very angry and had distanced myself from her, which is not my normal way we live. And she survived, but I went to the doctor and I said, while we were in it, and I said to a friend of mine who's a psychologist, I said, I don't understand what's going on. I'm so angry. And, he said, well, you're building a wall between you and her because it's going to hurt if you lose her. You still got 3 kids at home, all this stuff. And so I'm building a wall sort of like, so if she's torn away from me, it doesn't rip my heart out with me. I thought, well, that makes sense. So I built connections instead of walls between me and her. And when she got really, really ill again, and this time we had to bring all the kids home from by then college and stuff, and they said, it's all over. And she survived. She told me later on, and I don't want to get into it other than just say she was as sick as a human being can be and survive. Even the doctors at UCSF said this is just unbelievable that she's still here. She told me as she looked towards eternity that it meant everything in the world to her that her and I were connected. That she knew I was there, even though she couldn't really see me because she was slipping in and out of a coma all the time. And I thought, well, that's great. So and then you fast forward about, I've learned this lesson, right? So you fast forward like 15 years and I get diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So now I'm the person who's sick, right? And what's the first thing I start doing? Well, I start building a wall. And I got heartache, loss, self-preservation, self-doubt, the unknown, anxiety, fear. These are all the things that I'm playing with, and I'm constructing this barrier between me and my wife because of the fear and anxiety and despair that I have. And instead of opening up my heart and making myself vulnerable. And so she pointed that out to me and said, hey, you're doing exactly the thing you're not supposed to do that you did the last time, and I'm like, well, okay. And so I decided that there's like two paths. So when you go so I drew this a while back. Now it's hard for me because I can't read through this, okay? So you have to bear with me. I there's a group I belong to called Joy of Dementia, and I was drawing this because I want to make a display like this sometime so I can go out in public and talk about this with people because it's so important, and it's particularly in rural California. I don't know where it's like the rest of the United States. There are no services here. I mean, I had to drive 2 hours to even go talk to somebody about this kind of stuff. So there's nothing. So I thought about having a stand that looked like this. You see that?
Yeah.
And over here's all the things that go through your mind when you're diagnosed: the hopelessness, the despair, the destruction. There's no hope. There's that path, that journey, right? And over here is joy and renewal and time to live and love. There's this path. And so my conclusion was, as I was drawing, and I drew this over a couple of days, is that every day is a choice. So I chose to look outwards instead of inwards at my disease and see that I have my family and my friends and motorhoming and barbecuing and riding bikes and all the things that we like to do. So I'm kind of drawing down what I want to live. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I guess, so that's what I did.
We have a question from a viewer, and it's about your art. And they're asking, Wally, were you an artist prior to dementia diagnosis? And do you have artists in your family?
Uh, there's no artists in my family, and no. Other than once in a while I would doodle at work when we went to a meeting, but I never drew or, I mean, maybe when I was a kid. No, I just sat down and decided I wanted to start drawing, so I did.
Many people will wonder, is it just sort of a natural ability you have? Of course, you have some talent to begin with, but have you progressed and gotten a lot better and learned more about art?
No, I kind of just draw and enjoy myself, and sometimes it's a disaster, and sometimes it's great. I threw pottery for a while, and I did threw some. The guy said, "Geez, you're really good at this," and I think I was. I mean, I threw some nice bowls that we used to eat with that are not real thick and clunky or anything. I did it pretty quickly, and but there's so many steps in throwing pottery aside of the actual movement of the clay. You have to like let it dry and then you got to paint it, but the paint never looks like the color it's going to be and all this stuff. And I finally gave up doing it because it was too complicated. And I'm kind of that way even with, I like to do watercolors, and I'm kind of that way even with watercolors. It just gets to be complicated. I don't think there's anything much easier than picking up a pencil and put it down on a piece of
But,
paper and
but
let
with
your
watercolors and painting, you had to learn that, I mean, even after your diagnosis, right?
Yeah,
That's
so I took a there's a little art at our art council in town, our town of 1,500 people. They have a watercolor class you can attend for $10. And so I went to a couple of those to learn how to use watercolors because I had no idea even how to put it on the paper and how masking the paper off for you do. So I had some lessons to do that. And then I did watercolors for a while, and then lately I haven't been, but I've been having the urge to go back and try it again. I enjoyed it. There's a lot of camaraderie there. That's one of the nice things about art. It doesn't have to be a solo activity. It can be a group activity, and then you get to visit and stuff. But I find myself. It's like this, it's kind of like in waves. I mean, I'm not compelled to draw every day. We travel a lot, so I do a lot of art when we're traveling. I take my art stuff in my motorhome or when we travel and paint and stuff. But I don't know. That's
and what does it do for your mind though? Does it calm it? Does it make it more focused? What does it do for your mind?
Well, I know that I can go out, I can sit down and start drawing and time just disappears. there's no, I mean, other than, hunger and other needs that you have, I would just keep drawing. When I get in the mood, I draw and then I just draw and draw and draw. And then I don't. And sometimes I don't draw for a couple of weeks and then I'm drawing again. And I don't know if there's some kind of emotional part of that. I think there might be, because sometimes I just need to sit down and put things down that I'm thinking about. And I find it instead of, writing poetry or writing a book, it's just easier for me to draw something that sort of expresses how I feel. I like to, I look at drawings that people have done, and sometimes I don't copy like trace, but I'll redraw them or something like that. So like the other day, I went through something and I drew this sketch of this guy yelling. He's saying, "You're not hearing me." But I also have this one down here and it says, "You're not hearing me." And sometimes I wonder, which one of those you need to do to get your message across to somebody that you're talking to, because sometimes the quieter approach is the better approach, but sometimes you do feel like you need to just belt it out, So I I enjoy art, and I would certainly urge anybody that's got time on their hands to give it a shot. That's it.
Yeah. Wally, I want to close with giving you the chance, if you had any one piece of advice to offer those recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia. Yeah.
There's a quote I read a long time ago that says, "The acorn has no knowledge of the oak tree." We have oak trees all over our property, and in the fall they start shooting their acorns out like bullets, and they bounce off your roof and everything. And that acorn hits the ground and thinks, "Gee whiz, I've been torn asunder, and my life's over as I know it." And then eventually some squirrel comes by and puts him in the ground, and he thinks, "Well, that's it. Now I'm really screwed." And then later on, he comes up, and guess what he is? He ends up being a big giant oak tree. And we're on this journey, and we fought our way out of our when we were born with our mother. We didn't want to be outside. We liked it where we were. It's quiet, right? I love it here. And then you come out and you think after a while, like, I don't want to be back there. I want to be where I'm at. And we don't know where the next part of our journey goes. We know it goes somewhere, but we don't know. Many of us have our faith and stuff that we hang on to, but nonetheless, all of us are on that journey. And we're all going the same place together. And I think you need to get up every morning and decide for yourself what path you want to follow, the path of despair and destruction, or the path of hope and love. And I wish for all of you to follow the path of hope and love, because it's a lot more enjoyable way to live.
Wally, thank you so much for joining us and being so open and honest about your struggles and triumphs, and most of all, grace in dealing with dementia. Myself and our audience greatly appreciate it, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter on beingpatient.com, where we'll keep you up to date on all the upcoming talks. See you next time.